The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword turns 10 years old this year. Wow, that is just absolutely crazy. I remember back in November 2011, the day it came out, I walked down to local GameStop. Right as it opened, I researched, what time is it open? I need to get there as soon as I possibly can. Got there, I was like, hey, can I get the limited edition Skyward Sword with the Wii remote? And they're like, oh, no, you have to pre-order it. But you can buy the standard edition if you want. And I considered it. But I was like, yeah, no, I really want that Wii remote. So I went to the Target that was in the same plaza, and they just had it on the shelf. And I bought it, and that was my Thanksgiving break. And I loved Skyward Sword. You could absolutely blame it on I was young. I was 15 at the time. It feels weird calling that young, but whatever. 15th time, it was the very first time I bought a game on day one. Of course I was going to love it. But I really did. And even that back then, there were people that were complaining about it, saying oh no, this game is a bit of a wreck. I was like, no, it's great. You guys don't understand. But I guess so many people thought that. I couldn't completely shake that maybe they were right. So a couple years later, I went back to play it again on Hero Mode, and I admit that I noticed a few more of the issues that people were talking about. Now that I had the context of this is what people found wrong with it, now specifically looking for it, I could say, yeah, okay, I guess so, but I still loved it. I really did. And then Nintendo announced Skyward Sword HD for the Switch, and that was a big deal to me, because the announcement of Wind Waker HD back in 2013 was the final push that got me that, I need to buy a Wii U. And obviously that was a great purchase. And Skyward Sword HD was the push that I needed to buy a Switch. It was after a remake of my favorite Zelda game in Wind Waker, this was a remake of my second favorite. Of course I had to get it. But I knew, even before they'd announced it, I knew, if they did, people are going to be really upset about this, because first, they still haven't ported Wind Waker, Twilight Princess to the Switch, and now they're remaking possibly the most divisive entry in the series. There were always going to be people that are why this game doesn't deserve it. And then, of course, the big problem was people saying, wow, Nintendo is charging $60 for this 10-year-old game that they've barely changed. And at the time, I couldn't really disagree with them. Because I'm yeah, obviously Nintendo charging full price for their stuff is not at all new. It's not good, but that's not a new thing for them. But the amount of changes that they were being very quiet about it early on. Wind Waker, you knew, right off, it probably wasn't right up front, but we knew well ahead of time with Wind Waker, they're going to be reducing the Triforce quest and they're going to be adding a Swift Sail. Those are the two biggest problems with the game, now fixed. Twilight Princess HD, I legitimately don't know what that version changed to this day. I don't know. I never bought HD. I think Twilight Princess just isn't that interesting. But Skyward Sword HD, they were being very quiet about it. The only thing they said early on was now we've added support for button controls, which, obviously have to be able to play it on the Switch Lite. But that was all they had said. And if people are okay, but there's so many gameplay issues that could be addressed here. And I couldn't disagree with that. And then finally, a week, 2 weeks before the game came out, they released a trailer to say, here's all this stuff that's changed. You can fast forward text, you can skip cutscenes. People making a big deal, oh wow, they actually did fix the that you could, now that when you pick up items, when you reload your save file, it doesn't give you the item description every time. And Nintendo had to specifically point that out in the trailer. I'm yeah, obviously they were going to fix that. It was a bug in the original release. I do not remember anyone being surprised when they fixed that issue in Twilight Princess, where every time you loaded your save, it would tell you the value of every rupee. I don't get it. Camera control now? And stuff like that. And I was okay, now they're at the very least making smart quality of life improvements that I really did think Skyward Sword needed, even if I loved the game. Bought a Switch 2 months before it came out. Didn't open it for a month. It is. game came out, I decided to go back down to that same Target where I bought the original, like right as it opened, to pick it up, and they didn't have it out on the shelf. I didn't bother asking anyone at the counter because I'm a shy person. I just decided, like, okay, I'll go check over at the GameStop then. It'd be kind of funny if it was a reversal. GameStop didn't open for another hour, so that wasn't going to happen. So I had to call my dad and be like, hey, can you drive me to Walmart so I can check there? They didn't have it out on the shelf either, but because this was the third store, I was like, okay. I asked them, like, hey, do you have any copies? And they had just received it. Like, I think the guy said they had just gotten it in the mail that morning. Not the mail, the truck, just that morning. Like, no preparation time. They had it behind the counter in a bulk package. So they just pulled one out, scanned it in for me. And I don't know what the problem was. Like, maybe they hadn't scanned it into their system properly, whatever. It was $10 cheaper than it should have been, so I got it for $50, which, hey, that helps to reduce the issue of Nintendo charging too much for this game. And it was a great moment, and I got home and I was like, yep, immediately. So this video, this long-ass intro, is just here to discuss the fact that, like, how do I feel about Skyward Sword again now that it's been 10 years? I've matured. I've really gotten a chance to understand the things people complain about. I have more experience with the Zelda series as a whole. And it's on a new system now. So how did I feel about all of this? We'll start with just how I felt about the base game. Just regardless of picking up HD or if I just decided to play the Wii version again, how do I still feel about Skyward Sword? I understand what people are saying. It can be very handholdy. There are only 3 areas you go back to a lot. It does stuff that is just kind of annoying. Yeah, the motion controls are very frequent and are used for a lot of gameplay. Yeah, I guess you're right on all of that, but I just don't care. I think this game does too much right for it to be bogged down by stuff like that. Like, sure, there's only 3 areas and you go back to them, but you're doing new stuff in it each time, so you're at least doing new things. It can be kind of handholdy, but I prefer that to them not helping me in the slightest. Like, people would always complain, like, oh, Fi, she always interrupts you with stuff that I could have figured out on my own. And she's just a waste. And I'm like, okay, I guess, but it's better than Twilight Princess where I'm legitimately stuck on a puzzle. I call up Midna and I'm like, hey, can you help me? Like, what's going on? And she's just like, hey, we're in this dungeon to do this very general thing. It's like, okay, that's great. You're not helping me with the exact thing I'm stuck on. That's the only reason I want to talk to you. So it's one extreme versus the other, but I prefer one to the other. Plus, it is time for me to be controversial here. Fi is cuter than Midna, like, by a long shot. Fi is amazing and adorable, and I kind of love her. I think it's probably her fault that I have a thing for, like, the emotionless stereotype. Not stereotype, cliche, trope. Whatever. Whenever you see, like, an emotionless girl, I'm like, yep, that's me. Give me. I think it's Fi's fault. I will admit that the game does start to lose steam in the second half. Like, going to each area 3 times, I think, is overkill. Like, if I had the option to do the Song of the Hero stuff while I was in there for the Sacred Flame quest, then that would be okay. But the fact that you have to go back so many times does definitely drag. That part in the middle of the game where you have to do the first dungeon again, like, almost in its entirety, like, that's really weird. The fact that you have to I would have been fine with fighting me in prison twice, but I think 3 times was too many. The game honestly adheres to the rule of 3 just a little bit too much. But it still does so much stuff right. I think it has probably the best story in the series. Like, I've emotionally attached to these characters more than I ever have been. I will stand by that. I think this is the best version of Zelda as a character. I think this is the most interesting she's ever been. It's one of my favorite Links. It introduces new characters that are just iconic wonderful. Like Girahim and Groose, man. Groose is just perfect in every sense of the word. It looks beautiful. I love the art style. The soundtrack is just gorgeous, wonderful to listen to. The dungeons are expertly laid out. They are decently, like, you do have to think. You know, Fi will tell you, like, hey, she'll tell you too much, but if that weren't the problem, you do have to think. There are actually several puzzles in there that I took a while to try and I had to work out for quite a bit. And some that I just brute forced because I completely missed the explanation in the room, which is on me. The items you get are really creative and fun to use. The bosses are most of the time pretty interesting. And I think nowadays, looking back on it in hindsight, I think probably the thing I appreciate about Skyward Sword the most is the fact that it did do new things, like the way the world is laid out, the fact that it's not just like, it's not always you got a weapon, now that's what you use on the boss. Most of the time it is, but the first boss, like, you don't use the beetle to fight Girahim the first time. That is just all practicing your swordplay. The fact that they've made that swordplay more complicated, the game itself is more difficult, I would say. It leads to interesting new ways for encounters. The fact that you keep using items into further dungeons. Like, it's not just like, okay, I got this and now I use it for this dungeon and then the next dungeon is the next item. Like, I'm continuously using my entire arsenal. It just sort of adds up to the fact that in a post-Breath of the Wild world, like, Breath of the Wild was a big shakeup, and you can say it was the shot in the arm that the Zelda franchise needed. But Skyward Sword was a shot of originality while still maintaining the core of those linear 3D Zelda games I love so much. Breath of the Wild is good, but to someone who just doesn't care much about open world games, it's too big. There's too much. I don't like the fact that there's no direction, that I'm supposed to figure out my own stuff. I like having a set path. And I think Skyward Sword does that really well while still having its own identity. And it makes me sad that for the foreseeable future, Nintendo is going to be sticking with that open world style for Zelda. And, you know, the 2D stuff will always have a place as these smaller, lower budget games. But it could be a very long time before we get another linear 3D Zelda game. And in that sense, Skyward Sword is the swan song of that genre. I appreciate it a lot, and it makes me sad that we're not going to see that sort of stuff again. But let it not be mistaken, it was never a perfect game. There were always issues with it, with its pacing. That was primarily the bigger issue. And I think that was what the issue was leading up to Skyward Sword HD's release and the lack of communication on the sorts of improvements that were being made. Because Skyward Sword did not have this big issue, I would think, like Wind Waker did. Like, you can just point to Wind Waker and be like, Triforce Quest, slow sailing. Like, Wind Waker HD did make other small adjustments, like the fact that it skipped the cutscene for playing a melody after you had done it the first time on a specific play session. There were small quality of life improvements that were made for Wind Waker HD, but for the most part, that was a game that just had its big issues that needed to be sorted out. Skyward Sword HD is the opposite. The core game is so tight and well designed that you couldn't just point to it and say, like, this is the one thing that needs to be fixed. A lot of people would say Fi was that. I disagree, but I understand where they're coming from nowadays, at least. Skyward Sword needed a lot of small fixes. The sorts of things that would be really boring to say in a reveal trailer. But that didn't mean they weren't happening. Nintendo and Tantalus put in the work, and they really did change a lot of the core game. Like, it's not just the fact that now you could always sort of speed through text in Skyward Sword originally, but it was sort of slow and you couldn't just, like, skip through boxes. Now you can, most of the time. There are absolutely still times where, like, for some reason, you can't just hit the B button to instantly go to the end of the text box, and it's not consistent. I never understood a pattern. It was just, hey, sometimes I can't do that. So text goes faster, and not just that, they skip a lot. Like, a lot of the tutorial stuff, plenty of Fi's interruptions, they just don't happen anymore. Like, they're just like, okay, the player can figure this out. This character does not need to talk to you. There are legitimately conversations that are just cut entirely. Most of Fi's stuff is just relegated to, like, you can hit the button to hear it if you want, but she doesn't interrupt you anymore. But there's other stuff that is just gone entirely. The fact that they give you button controls is nice. I can't imagine using it, though. Skyward Sword is a game that was very much built around its motion controls. Trying to play that game with the button controls, like, I'm sure that they did the best they could to make them work, and I've seen people in comments saying, like, yeah, no, this is really what this game needed, but God, just conversions like that are so weird. Like, if you've ever tried to play No More Heroes, Heroes Paradise on the PS3 using a standard controller, it's so weird because it's clear that the game was not built with a standard controller in mind. So they're mapping all this motion control stuff to different buttons and combinations. It's so awkward and uncomfortable. And there's just plenty of areas in this game. Like, how does balancing work? Like, you're supposed to, like, move with the analog stick and hold the Wii Remote or Joy-Con to, like, keep balancing. Like, do you use another stick? Like, that's gotta be weird. So I feel like motion controls are really just the way you have to go with it, even if they give you the button control as an option. The fact that they don't interrupt you with item descriptions anymore. Having camera control it's both surprising how nice it is to have, but at the same time, it's not really necessary. Like, I absolutely never used the lock-on button to just to just move the camera anymore once I had a second analog stick, but it's honestly not that hard to go back, I don't think. Even these really tiny things, like the text boxes now tell you the name of the person who's talking. Like, I was really surprised that was new, because I'm like, yeah, I guess most Zelda games don't do that, but it's a pretty standard thing in most games. It's a nice little thing to have. Skyward Sword, a lot of people were complaining, like, oh, they're not, like, this is easily the least changed game, and Nintendo's just being lazy. Honestly, at the end of the day, I think Skyward Sword HD might be the most changed, because it's not just these big areas, it's these small, smart little changes that permeate throughout the entire game and really do transform the experience. Like, without a doubt, Skyward Sword HD is the definitive version of the game. It is just much better to play. And having a version that's now free of all these little problems just reaffirms its placement in my heart that it is the second best game in the Zelda series. Now that it's not bogged down by all these little things. Like, it still doesn't top Wind Waker. That game is just a majesty on, like, every front now, especially with its HD remake. But Skyward Sword still does so much right that even Wind Waker didn't. Of course, it still has its small issues, like the pacing in the second half definitely did drag the experience down, but the finale is so good that I still ended on a positive note. There's just sort of one issue with the HD conversion, and that's the way the motion controls work. Because the technology is just so different between the Wii Remote and the Joy-Cons. And first of all, just the Joy-Cons, admittedly more comfortable to just hold them like two separate Joy-Cons than I thought they would be, but the Wii Remote and Nunchuck are just so ergonomic. The Wii Remote's got a nice heft to it. It's got that rubber sleeve that makes it a little easier to hold on to, if a bit of a sweat magnet. So the Wii Remote and Nunchuck will always just be sort of better to hold, but it doesn't just end there. They added the ability to recenter the gyro in the right Joy-Con at any time by hitting the Y button. And that's nice, because I absolutely was hitting that button a lot in ways that I wouldn't have done it on the Wii, where they didn't give you the option except for the pointer. But I think that's because of the lack of a sensor bar to like center and anchor the motion controls, it tends to go off spec a lot more often. Like if I'm playing the game on the Wii, I pull my sword out, it is always at a neutral position. If I pull it out now on the Switch, it very well could be listing off in one direction, and I have to hit the button to center it. It's an easy step, but it feels sort of non-Nintendo that there's now this thing where I have to hit a button to fix the motion controls. It's a necessity, but it feels like a very non-Nintendo thing to let happen. And it's not just the basic sword swinging, but like all of the other stuff. Like if I'm flying the beetle or the loft wing, a lot of times it starts off listing in one direction, and I have to hit the button to center it before I can work along with it in ways that I would not have to do on the Wii. Now, granted, on the Wii, you don't have the freedom in how you hold it. Like, if you're flying the beetle or the loft wing, you have to hold the Wii remote like perfectly horizontally, which is kind of awkward to do if you're sitting down in a chair and playing the game. On the Switch, I can still hold it a little bit tilted upward and just center the gyro and use it. It still ends up being kind of awkward, but it's something I can do. It's just the fact that centering the gyro is something I was doing all the time, where with a little bit of effort, it wouldn't be perfectly comfortable. But on the Wii, I wouldn't have to worry about that at all. And it does sort of bog down the experience, but mostly in terms of just thinking back on how the Wii version played, like once I get into the groove of the Switch, like it's not, hitting Y is very easy to recenter. You can do it even in the middle of combat. The motion controls are extremely responsive, possibly owing to the fact that this version now runs at 60 FPS instead of 30 on the Wii. And on the Wii, it still felt pretty sluggish. And it just feels a lot more responsive. I swear you swing your sword faster on the Switch. So it means that you sort of can flail around a bit more, but you're still not encouraged to. In fact, you're very much actively punished for doing so. It's the HD conversion for Skyward Sword is not quite perfect, but they made a lot of changes to make it a better game, and I think realistically it's the best we could expect. If Nintendo is not going to do another motion control focused console, the gyro sensitivity that's present in the Joy-Cons is really about the best we could expect for this game, and it's better than it just being locked on the Wii forever. So Skyward Sword is still a fantastic Zelda game. The HD conversion is really good. But I needed to be sure just how good it was. Let it not be said that I did not put the work into these videos. Same way with the Monster World 4 remake, where as soon as I finished the remake, I'm like, okay, let me just play through the entirety of the original again, just so I have full comparison in preparation for this, for a video. I'm not crazy. I did not play through Skyward Sword twice in the span of a week. But after I finished the HD version, I did play through the first dungeon of the Wii version again, just to make sure my memories of how the Wii version played weren't tricking me. And immediately as I got back onto the Wii, I realized the extent of these changes, how much they added up with HD. Like, first of all, the game looks really nice in 1080p in a way that, like, I mean, it still looks good on the Wii for a Wii game, but you look at it like, oh man, those edges, oh god, that is so much dithering. Like, it is really nice to have the game in HD. You start to notice how small the text boxes are, how slow they are, I should say, how often you're interrupted in ways you wouldn't be on the Switch, how sluggish the game feels. Like, I could swing, if I'm swinging the sword, I could swing the Wii remote and visibly notice the delay before an action happens in a way that just doesn't really happen on the Switch. It's, at the very least, I'm sure it's not instantaneous, but it's much more subtle. The fact that, honestly, while I thought playing the Switch version, like, this doesn't seem to be reading my directions quite right, it was the same on the Wii. So I'm willing to more blame it on myself, because it is still very accurate, I feel, at least. And you just start to realize, like, oh wow, the Wii version may not be quite as good as I remember it, but I don't have to worry about going back and realizing, like, oh, this game isn't quite as good as I remember it, because we have the HD version that is what the original was aiming to do this entire time. And I'm really happy I got it. And I feel like maybe if you were sort of negative on Skyward Sword, or maybe just on the fence with the original, this HD version may have done enough to its core flow that it could change your mind and you can start seeing all the positives the game has. I mean, it's entirely possible you were just so negative for some reasons that you can't change, but I feel like it really can do a lot to improve the experience. And of course, if you loved Skyward Sword originally like I did, this version is just a miracle. It's a blessing that it exists in this beautiful form. And I can only hope that that a new generation will discover the quality of Skyward Sword, how much it did right, instead of remembering it for all of its failures that prompted Nintendo to very much go in the opposite direction with Breath of the Wild. Like, instead of having too much direction, now there's none. Instead of having limited areas, here's this entire world. Instead of having this carefully well-constructed story, here's basically no story. And I hope that this prompts Nintendo that, hey, maybe these two types of Zelda games can coexist, like alternate, like release Breath of the Wild 2, make that your next big open world game, refine what the open world Breath of the Wild was supposed to be originally, and then do another linear game, and then just sort of alternate every once in a while. Like, if we could get 2 Zelda games out per generation, that'd be crazy, but that'd be kind of cool. Like, you have the open world one, and then the linear one, and then throw a 2D one in there somewhere. Still, we could still use some Oracle remakes, I would say. Yeah, I'm glad that 10 years on, Skyward Sword can still give me that same wonderful experience I had playing it in 2011. And I'm glad that, honestly, all of my memories are as they were. It's still a fantastic game that I just love playing. And it's at least enough to tide me over until Breath of the Wild 2. But honestly, having this game in my possession sounds kind of weird. Having this game fresh in my memory could honestly make me more critical of Breath of the Wild 2. Because I'm like, yeah, but this is this kind of Zelda game I like. So Breath of the Wild 2, you're going to have to work really hard to impress me if you're sticking to being an open world. And it's great that I'm finally getting use out of my Switch. Like, I'm recording this the night before Great Ace Attorney Chronicles comes out. Of course, I pre-ordered that. I'm getting that physically on the Switch. That's going to be great to have. And it's only a month until No More Heroes 3 comes out. I can't wait for that. Give me my No More Heroes. Finally give me what I was promised at the Switch reveal event. But until then, Skyward Sword will always hold a special place in my heart, and I hope it does for all of you guys, and I hope that this HD version does a lot for this game's reputation and gives it what it deserves.